Welcome to the Sinica Podcast, a weekly discussion of current affairs in China, produced in partnership with SupChina. SupChina is the best way to keep on top of the latest news from China through our free email newsletter, our handy smartphone app, and of course at the website supchina.com. It's a feast of business, political, and cultural news about a nation that is reshaping the world. I'm Kaiser Kuo, and I am in New York City today at the Asia Society, where I am thrilled to be joined by the Honorable Kevin Rudd, familiar, I'm sure, to everyone listening as the former Prime Minister of Australia, who also served as Minister for Foreign Affairs and as a Member of Parliament. Kevin Rudd began his career as a student of China, studying Chinese history and the Chinese language, which he speaks with delightful fluency. He went on to a career in diplomacy and in politics. He is the inaugural president of the Asia Society Policy Institute here in New York, and he's also pursuing a doctoral degree at Jesus College, Oxford University. Prime Minister Rudd, Kevin, if I may be so bold?
Kevin's fine.
Welcome to Sinica.
Happy to be on the program.
We are at a moment right now where we really feel the force of history, when we are all very conscious of the convergence of these major historical currents. And so many of the questions I want to put to you are commensurately weighty, I fear. But Kevin, let's start with something easy. I mean, you wrote your thesis at ANU on Wei Jingsheng, the worker come dissident associated with the fifth modernization of democracy. And the democracy law.
I remember it very well.
Yeah, very well. And that was under the late, great Pierre Ryckmans. Now you're working, as I understand it, on a dissertation under the not late but also great Rana Mitter. Is that correct?
Yeah, Rana is an extraordinary historian of modern China, 20th century China, and particularly of the Republican period. Apart from all that, he has got a great sense of humor.
He is. He's been a guest on our show a couple of times. And,
that's right.
We adore him.
It's good to see you maintaining the standards here.
Yeah, he's terrific. It's hard, though, for me to think of two people as different as the person you're studying now, Xi Jinping, and Wei Jingsheng, and the worldviews are a world apart. You've talked quite a bit about the worldview of Xi Jinping and the party that he now leads, but perhaps for our listeners who haven't followed your recent speeches, you could quickly lay out for us what you see, at this point at least in your research, what the basic tenets, the features of that worldview are, and the goals that grow out of these basic features. Do you have any particular hypotheses about Xi Jinping that you set out to test as you began working on your research?
The reason for the research project is because every man and his dog is now asking the question about what does China want. Given the structure of Chinese politics, it's therefore important to come to grips with what does Xi Jinping want. Hence my interest in his worldview. The thesis that I want to explore is the extent to which China's worldview under Xi Jinping has changed in the post-2012-2013 period, and if it has, in what direction, and why that is the case. And I would prefer to do this in a properly research format rather than run off totally seat-of-the-pants judgments based on the accumulated wisdom and erroneous judgments of a lifetime of living and working with China. So that's why I'm trying to do it systematically. Most people think I'm nuts for doing it, but there you go.
Wading through his turgid writings.
Yeah, all that, and dealing with a bunch of my fellow students who are all old enough to be my children. So that's fine, but it's good and humbling for folks like me as well. I have quite a brilliant tutor at Jesus College, Oxford, who's in her early 30s, and I sit and listen carefully to her reflections on Chinese behaviors through the Belt and Road Initiative in various parts of Africa. She's brilliant, so I sit quietly at her feet and listen.
Very good.
On the Xi Jinping thesis, though, to what extent has the worldview changed? Your listeners will well be familiar with the end of Tao Guang Yang Hui Jue Bu Dang Tou. Hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead. Formally interred by Xi Jinping at the party's work conference on foreign affairs in November of 2014. And its replacement with a difficult and somewhat inchoate concept called Fanfai Wei, which I think is best reflected in English as a more activist foreign policy.
Sure.
And certainly, I think since then, we've seen lots of evidence of that. So the question is, activist in which direction? And what I've sought to do in recent speeches, including one I gave at West Point
in
March of this year, is articulate what I describe as Xi Jinping's sort of concentric circles of interest.
Right.
And very simply, and again, your listeners will be familiar with this, number one, hold on to power, including the party in power and Xi within the party. Not remarkable for a Leninist state, but important for people in this country, the United States, and around the world, to remember that we are dealing with a Marxist-Leninist institution here.
That's right.
Number two, maintain the unity of the motherland. If you want to seek the fundamental understanding for why we see repressive policies in Xinjiang at the moment, frankly, it's so deeply etched into the political psychology of Chinese leaders that those who lose parts of the empire are badly reviewed in history. Those who consolidate the empire and maintain Beijing's control over it, or previous imperial capital's control over it, are reviewed well in history, hence Taiwan, hence Tibet, hence Xinjiang.
And Xi certainly sees himself as somebody who will stand in the judgment of history. He's certainly somebody who's quite conscious about his legacy.
Certainly in my conversations with him over the years, that's the distinct impression. People like Wang Qishan regard themselves as significant historical raconteurs, both on China and the West. I think that is true. He reads extensively. When you go to Xi Jinping, he's also a significant reader, not just of his own country's history, of the party's history in particular in the 20th century, but also a reasonable read of international history as well. So he sees himself in a Carlylean view of history, I believe, as one of the great men of history. Just to round out the rest of that Xi Jinping worldview.
We've gotten to fighting the vociferous forces and keeping the country together.
That's right.
Then out to...
I'm glad you used the word vociferous as well. I used it recently in a speech, and most people asked what the hell it meant.
It just has a nice alliteration with forces, so, you know.
And I think it's sort of neatly onomatopoeic as well.
Yeah, it is.
Third one is, of course, growing the economy in a sustainable fashion. That's necessary for, as we know, of continuing party legitimacy. And the legitimacy the party has enjoyed in the post-78 period, and which had been destroyed in the pre-78 period for reasons we're all familiar with. But with a new twist, which is sustainable economic growth, given people's now legitimate and fundamental concerns about the environment. Again, a challenge to party legitimacy, given that it's the flip side, the downside, the cost of rapid, unconstrained growth post-78. You lose that one, you start to lose legitimacy as well. So it's a new and trickier double-edged sword. I think 4 is, of course, China's historical concern with its 14 neighboring states. People lose sight of the fact that China has just as many neighboring states, the largest number in the world as Russia.
Right.
And this creates unique challenges for China, ever mindful of its history. It's not simply a statement of the obvious to say that China's domestic security concerns have often come across its borders, whether it's Japan from the east, the Qing from the northeast, the Mongolians to the north, even the Xiongnu to the north and northwest in more ancient times. But basically the borders are seen as problem areas in Chinese history. So China's strategy for the borders is, I will maintain benign, and if I can possibly secure it, supine relations with neighbours. Number 5 out of 7 is its maritime periphery.
Sure.
And that is the 1841 plus experiences that China's major assault on its sovereignty, self-confidence.
Seafaring barbarians.
Yeah, and sense of national dignitas when perfidious Albion, otherwise known as the British, arrived and in the noble pursuit of the British Empire and all the ethics associated with it, said, please consume our opium or we'll blow open these ports and turn them to treaty ports, which is what they did. Later, of course, in the Second Opium War with the French, then we had other problems later in China's 19th century and then 20th century history. So the maritime periphery, for understandable domestic reasons in China, represents a problem. The only victory ever scored was temporarily by Lin Zexu and not many since. So therefore, the imperative of creating a maritime space for China, which pushes the American periphery well out into the Pacific and beyond, certainly the first island chain. And then sixth and second and last, in my view, is the continental periphery, which is also relevant in China's history for security reasons, reinforced by concerns about the rise of militant Islamism in Central Asia and certainly Southwest Asia, and therefore the need, from China's perspective, to create a safer periphery for itself as well. Hence, not just domestic policies in Xinjiang, but also a broader strategic concept, I think, through the Belt and Road Initiative, that if you can bring growth and development to these parts of Eurasia, that over time you will lessen the attractiveness of militant Islamism. That's part of the strategy, but more broadly beyond the Islamic footprint across Eurasia, but to the rest of Eurasia, the Middle East and into East Africa, it is, I think, to cause China to become the globally indispensable economic power for that vast continental terrain.
Right.
Which brings us to the last one, which is in the Xi Jinping worldview, what he has called, I think, a new international order, one which China can fashion, shape, and in fact the reform of which he now says in his most recent speech at the Foreign Affairs Work Conference of the end of 2018, or June 2018.
Lead the reform of global governance.
Lead the reform. Lingdao, no longer Yingdao, no longer Canjia.
Right. Yeah.
So when you're starting to Lingdao things as opposed to Yingdao or Yingxiang.
Right. There's more direct.
There's a gradation. And there would have been a subcommittee on changing the verb from Yingdao to Lingdao.
Yingdao is not quite passive, but it's not as active, right?
Lingdao is more in your face than a Yingdao.
Absolutely.
For those of us who study the entrails of these things and frankly don't have a life.
So I think that's a very neat encapsulation. Are we ready at this point now where the worldview of Xi Jinping is simply interchangeable with the worldview of the Chinese Communist Party? I mean, I think, can we use these two ideas now interchangeably?
Given the power consolidation process of first-term Xi Jinping has been achieved with comprehensive success, for which purposes we should conduct a case study interview with someone like Bo Xilai to see how he feels about it.
Let's just go up to the Qingdong prison and
Zhou Yongkang and the boys. It hasn't turned out well for those who were opposed.
Indeed.
So I think there is a consolidation of power and authority. Subject to some carping at the edges, I think it's fair to conclude, and with still some internal criticism, that the Xi Jinping worldview and that of the party more broadly are synchronous.
Yes. We tend, on the ascent of each new general secretary of the CCP, to invest him, always him, with fears, with hopes, sometimes more naive of us. And I think this, of course, was the same with Xi Jinping. Can you talk about your own evolution of thinking? When you have had truck with the man since really you were PM in 07, Kevin 07, and this was when he was sort of anointed as the successor. He was already very much on the stage, and I believe you had encounters with him. How has your thinking about the man changed in that decade plus?
I think the one thing I probably got right about Xi Jinping was simply based on an estimation of his character and personality, that he would not be content with being primus inter pares. Maybe it's just political instinct, but when you run into a guy, in this case, who aspires to the leadership of his country, you soon get an impression as to whether they are an apparatchik from central casting or whether they have a sense of historical gravitas about themselves. With Xi Dada, it was certainly the latter.
Yeah.
So I did write way back then, I think in 12, I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs magazine saying that he would be the most powerful Chinese leader since Deng. Qualitatively, I may have got that wrong. We may reinterpret that as being since Mao, but history is still open on that. I think the thing that I got wrong was that I thought he would, over time, potentially take the country in a more liberal direction. And plainly, that analysis back then has not been borne out by a range of developments we've seen not just in terms of his individual power consolidation, but also in terms of what we've seen with his attitude to the reassertion of the role of the party over the state and the party in most domains of, let's call them, Chinese life.
We'll talk about that, but you mentioned something. You talked about his sort of political instinct. Now, we tend, again, to invest Chinese politics with a sort of aura of mystique, but I think we really should be asking the same questions about China as we do about other political systems.
Yeah, I've never bought the mystique line.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear it.
I think it's horseshit.
Good.
If you can say that on this family
that's
program.
Okay. It is a family program. We'll have to. One question, though, I'd love your take on is that as someone who has been a politician, who has been through the rough and tumble of retail politics yourself, I'm puzzled when I look at Xi Jinping. I don't feel like he has the obvious tactical genius of a Mao or strategic vision or the personal charisma or even the sort of charm of a Deng or even a Jiang Zemin who could actually be charming. There's something about him that seems sort of waxen and sort of slow moving. I'm not sure you see a gravitas in him, but I'm asking about Xi, the retail politician. He obviously possesses some cunning. I mean, if you look at all the people who are locked up right now, the people who he's simply outmaneuvered. But what is it? What did you? And you saw this early on. You saw this canny.
No, I didn't see the canny bit. What I saw was the sense of historical mission.
Right.
And when anyone you engage in frames their actions within a wider historical frame, you have a deep sense that this is not just the transaction of the moment, but they're on a mission. And secondly, in terms of Xi Jinping, in terms of political skillcraft, what I'd say is people often forget how deeply instilled Chinese political leaders are in Marxist-Leninism, and in particular the epistemologies and methodologies of that system of thought, in particular, again, dialectics. And the reason I mention that is that if you look at the essentials of dialectical thinking and analysis, which is about thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and you look at Xi's exposition of the same in a couple of separate study sessions for the Politburo on these subjects over the last several years, my impression is that when Xi approaches his domestic political challenges, he's constantly looking at almost the science of opposites and the science of action and reaction, and is therefore ahead of the game politically. So therefore, when you have seen his action against his political opponents more directly, I think he has thought not just pragmatically and politically about that, but also somewhat dialectically. When you look at his identification of potential sources of dissent within the country, whether it's from the private sector, whether it's from NGOs, whether it's from churches, Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, whatever.
The liberal intelligentsia.
Or from what Homer Simpson once described as the intellectuals, one of my favourite terms from Homer Simpson, and sensing, therefore, where the sources of dissent against the Leninist state can come from. He's usually one step ahead of the pace.
Is that hard? I mean, is it really? I mean, isn't that something?
You can say it's intuitive. Right. The thing about his dialectical approach is I think it's structural. That's the point I'm making. And he has encouraged his colleagues to think in those terms. Your final part of your question was, does he exhibit a charisma towards the Laobaixing, the masses? Not being a member of the Laobaixing, I don't feel qualified to judge how his personal style is consumed by Chinese punters. Certainly when I've taken taxis in Beijing, and you may be surprised to know that I do, not always, but I do from time to time and have a chat, they've approved of what he's done in anti-corruption, and they've been less enamoured of other things.
Right. Dialectical materialism has never struck me as a particularly sophisticated system of thought, either Hegelian or Marxist version of it. And I maybe part of me wants to attribute to him maybe a greater intelligence than that. I mean, the man is pretty broadly read, at least he claims to be so. I wonder, though,
but my point to you is that I think he's both things. He is broadly read, but what I'm saying is there is a systemology to the way in which he analyzes politics and economics, which I think has been deeply shaped by Marxist pedagogy.
Okay.
And unlike you, I don't think Marxism-Leninism is without, shall I say, a level of intellectual sophistication. I think it does. I don't agree with it. That's a separate matter. But as an elaborate worldview and as a systemology for understanding your place in history, historical materialism, and how you advance the cause, dialectical materialism, and Leninism being the particular vehicle of the moment, the party, frankly, it coheres, at least in their thinking. This is not a basis for expounding a set of principles which are going to win you 1,000 votes out there in the villages in Heilongjiang South. Not going to do that. But I'm simply seeking to explain this as a means of informing how he constructs his worldview.
We've got this now. So now we have this cognitive analytical framework of